Hi, this is the Apologist bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. Here's a really good book that's been a standard for a long, long time by Geisler and Turek. It's called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I've done a couple of previous podcasts on it. This really is one of the books, I think about all the books that I've read and looked into more deeply. And I think this is one that everybody needs to have on their bookshelf. It covers the broad gamut of apologetics, everything from why do we think there's such a thing as truth, and then the beginning of the universe, and design in the universe, and miracles, and Jesus, and the New Testament, and rising from the dead, the resurrection, and the Bible. I mean, it's unbelievable. And there are several appendices that say things like, if God, why evil? Isn't that just your interpretation? And even on the Jesus Seminar, I know they're not really big today, but they were so powerful for a while as far as casting doubt on Jesus in the New Testament. So that would be wonderful to read as well. Anyway, I want to do chapter 11 today. The top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. Okay, top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. And they start with a quote by Peter Kreeft. Why would the apostles lie? If they lied, what was their motive? What did they get out of it? What they got out of it was misunderstanding, rejection, persecution, torture, and martyrdom. Hardly a list of perks. Yeah, I guess. So they said, there are 10 reasons that we can be confident that the New Testament writers didn't play fast and loose with facts. So here we go. Let's go through the 10. See if we can get them in here in this podcast. Number 1, the New Testament writers included embarrassing details about themselves. And they said, this is one way that historians check to see if an author is telling the truth. It's called the principle of embarrassment. And the principle assumes that, if an embarrassing detail comes into the writing, that's probably true, because most authors are going to leave things out that make them look bad. So how does the New Testament measure up? So it says, look at the New Testament. What happens for the disciples, for example? How are they portrayed? Dim-witted. They fail to understand what Jesus is saying. That's in Mark 9 and Luke 18 and John 12. They're uncaring. Jesus asks them, please stay with me and pray while I'm alone there praying in the garden, and they fall asleep on him. They later believe Jesus is a God-man, but they admit they twice fell asleep when he needed them the most. Wow. They don't try to give him a proper burial. It was Joseph of Arimathea that did that. What else about the disciples? They're being rebuked. I mean, after all, Jesus called Peter Satan. That's in Mark 8. Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong on the theological issues, several theological issues. They're cowards. All of the disciples except one hid when Jesus went to the cross. And they're doubters. Over and over, Jesus said that he would rise from the dead, but when they hear the resurrection, it says some were even doubtful after they see him risen. That was Matthew 28. So they said, if they're making up the story, you know what they're going to have? They're not going to put that kind of stuff in there. They're going to be brave. They're going to be bold. They're going to stand with Jesus all the time. So that's really a good point. Here's number 2. The New Testament writers included embarrassing details and difficult sayings, not just of themselves, but Jesus. So they're honest about Jesus. Now they have these self-incriminating details about themselves, but there are a lot of embarrassing facts, if you think about it, that come out about Jesus that they talk about. Think about what his mother and brothers said about him. They thought of him as being out of his mind. They were going to take him home. Poor guy, he's kind of lost it here. We're going to take care of him. That's in Mark 3. He's not believed by his own brothers. They saw him. They were raised with him. That's John 7. In John 7 also, he's thought to be a deceiver. He's deserted by many of his followers, John 6. He turns off some of the Jews who believed in him. That was John 8, to the point that they wanted to stone him in that same chapter. Wow, that's pretty powerful. He's called a drunkard in Matthew 11. He's called demon-possessed, Mark 3 and John 7 and 8. He's called a madman, John 10. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute. That could be considered a sexual advance at that time. That was Luke 7. He's crucified by the Jews and Romans, but that, according to Deuteronomy 21, puts you under God's curse. So they said, if you're trying to depict Jesus as a perfect, sinless God-man, are you going to put those things in there unless they're true? So the best explanation for all these embarrassing details is that they really occurred. And besides, there's some difficult sayings that Jesus came up with that the New Testament writers probably wouldn't include if they're just making this stuff up. Thinking about what Jesus said, the Father is greater than I. That's John 14. He seems to predict something incorrect, that he's going to come back to earth within a generation, Matthew 24. Then he says about his second coming that no one knows the time, and including himself. That's Matthew 24. He seems to deny his deity because he asks the rich young ruler, why do you call me good? No one's good except God alone. That's Luke 18. He's seen cursing a fig tree because it doesn't have figs, but that wasn't the season for figs. That's Matthew 21. He also doesn't seem able to do miracles in his hometown. He heals a few sick people, but that's about it. That's Mark 6. Isn't that interesting? Now, I said there are reasonable explanations for these difficult sayings. So they're not saying that nobody knows what Jesus meant, but it just says, why would the New Testament writers put those things in there if they're trying to pass off a lie here as the truth? I think that makes a good point. Here's number 3. The New Testament writers left in demanding sayings of Jesus. Okay, so he talk about the standards that he set up. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. That doesn't seem like a human invention. Think about the things Jesus said. Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery in his heart. That's Matthew 5. In fact, several of these, I won't keep saying Matthew 5 because these are from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, anybody who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to be an adulteress. And anybody who marries that divorced woman is committing adultery. Jesus says, don't resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other one. If somebody wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have it. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Boy, that's not very popular, is it, to hear things like that? How about this? I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Well, who would want to do that? And he says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Wow, these are all things that today we kind of breeze past those. We don't want to think about those. Don't judge or you're going to be judged. And they said, I'm saying they, that's Geisler and Turek, these commands are either difficult or impossible. And they seem to go up against the best interests of people who wrote them down. They're sure contrary to the desires of people today. People want a religion today, or a spirituality, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't have any moral demands. And think about the moral demands that Jesus was coming up with. If you think about a sin and that's sinful, then that means everybody, including the writers of the New Testament, they're all guilty. If you have such stringent standards for divorce and remarriage, that doesn't seem like it'd be the best interest of people writing the New Testament. To not resist the insults of an evil person, that goes against our basic human instinct, doesn't it? And to pray for enemies, that goes way beyond any ethic ever uttered. And on and on. So these commands, they said, are clearly not the commands that people would impose on themselves. Who could live up to these? Only a perfect person. Maybe that's the point, they say. All right, here's number 4. The New Testament writers carefully distinguished Jesus' words from their own. Now, they didn't use quotation marks in first century Greek, but the New Testament writers clearly indicated when Jesus said something. So why do we cite that as evidence, they say? Because it had been very easy for the writers to solve problems by putting words into Jesus' mouth. Right? So it would have been very convenient. They could think about how convenient, here's an example. How about circumcision? Jesus doesn't say anything about circumcision. Well, if you're just making up stuff, wouldn't you say, thus, yea, verily, Jesus says? How about obeying the law of Moses? Jesus doesn't talk about that. Speaking in tongues, nothing there. Women in the church. You just start making up quotes about Jesus, and that would solve that problem. Church organization, church hierarchy, nothing. So the New Testament writers don't do that. They seem to try to stay true to what Jesus said and didn't say. Paul, for example, he wrote a lot of New Testament books, and he dealt with those controversial problems like women in the church. He never pulls rank. He just quotes Jesus a few times. So I think that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that one. How about number 5? Here's another reason that we can trust these writers. The New Testament writers include events related to the resurrection that they wouldn't have invented. Like what? Well, how about the burial of Jesus? They have Joseph of Arimathea, who's part of the Sanhedrin. Well, that's the Jewish ruling council that had sentenced him to die. Why would they make that up? Can you imagine how angry and bitter Christians would be about the Jewish authorities? Why would they put a member of the Sanhedrin in such a favorable light? That's a good point. What about the first witnesses? Who shows up first? Women. And one of the women was Mary Magdalene. Luke admits she was demon-possessed. You wouldn't do that in a made-up story. Women weren't considered reliable witnesses back then in that culture. In fact, Geisler and Turek say a woman's testimony didn't have any weight at all in a court of law. So if you're going to make up a resurrection story, you'd have these brave guys, right? Here comes Peter, here comes Thomas, here comes Andrew, and they'd come into the tomb. But no, they had the women, which if it didn't happen, you wouldn't have set it up that way. How about the conversion of priests? Some people say, well, why didn't the risen Jesus appear to the Pharisees? But it says many priests really were believers. Luke writes, the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. That's Acts 6:7. So I think that's interesting, right? So I like that one. How about the explanation of the Jews? What did they say about the empty tomb? Well, chief priests say his disciples came during the night and stole him away, right? And we'll give you money, right? So the soldiers did that, took that money. So it says, notice that Matthew makes it clear his readers already know about this explanation because this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day, Matthew says in chapter 28. That means his readers would know whether or not he was telling the truth. If he's making up an empty tomb story, why would he give his readers such an easy way to expose his lies? Notice what he's saying here. Hey, if you don't believe me, talk to other people out there. They've heard this story over and over. So that tomb must have really been empty. And the Jewish enemies of Christianity must really have been circulating that story. Number 6. Again, remember we're talking about the 10 top reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. Number 6. The New Testament writers include more than 30 historically confirmed people in their writing. That's interesting. They have way too many true people, right? People that really lived. They would have wrecked their credibility if they had put real people in a fictional story. So they have Pilate and Caiaphas and Festus and Felix, the entire Herodian bloodline. Somebody would have exposed them for falsely implicating these people in the events that never really happened. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Like if I was going to do a story, a fictional story, and I put Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States, people would look it up and say, no, Eisenhower was never part of that. And then there go my credibility. Here's number 7. The New Testament writers include divergent details. See, some people say, oh, hey, I see some apparent contradictions in the gospel accounts, so you can't trust them. Well, like what? Well, Matthew says there's one angel at the tomb of Jesus. John mentions 2. Hey, isn't that a contradiction? No. Geisler and Turek say, no, it's actually the opposite. Divergent details actually strengthen the case that they're eyewitnesses. It says, well, first, let's point out that thing about the angels. Matthew says there doesn't say there's only one angel. But why did he mention just one if there really were 2 there? Well, for the same reason, if you were to read 2 different newspaper reporters covering the same event, they would choose different details. So 2 independent eyewitnesses rarely see all the same details. They never describe an event in exactly the same words. I mean, all of the disciples that wrote these stories talked about Jesus rising from the dead, but they had some different details. Said, in fact, when a judge hears 2 witnesses giving exactly the same word-for-word testimony, what do you think he or she concludes? The witnesses got together. They made sure their stories agreed. So I know J. Warner Wallace talks a lot about that. He was a cold case detective, and he said, if you hear two slightly different accounts of the same event, that's likely to have been really eyewitness testimony. But if it's two people telling exactly the same story, there's something going on. That's collusion, right? They're working that out together. So, let's see. It says the Gospels agree that Jesus rose from the dead. They just have different complementary details. I think that's a good point. They quote from Simon Greenleaf. He was a Harvard law professor. He wrote, I guess, what's considered a standard study on what constitutes legal evidence. He converted to Christianity. And you know why? He says the main reason was examining the gospel witnesses. Now, this guy knew what eyewitness testimony was all about. And here's what Greenleaf said. He concluded that the four Gospels, quote, would have been received in evidence in any court of justice without the slightest hesitation. Okay, so these are so far our reasons that we're talking about why we can trust the New Testament writers are telling the truth. Here's number 8. The New Testament writers challenge their readers to check out verifiable facts, even facts about miracles. Now think about what Paul says. He makes a claim in 1 Corinthians 15. He says there are 500 eyewitnesses, and most of them are still around. And so there are other places, by the way, as well. Like he declared to Festus and King Agrippa about the resurrected Christ and on and on. So he must have seen these things, and he's challenging people. Go check it out. These people are still around. And number 9, New Testament writers describe miracles like other historical events. They make them simple. They're unembellished. They're not fanciful like the Gospel of Peter that, I don't know, this is probably worth it. Let me just read this to you. So this is like 150 years after the crucifixion. Somebody wrote about Christ's resurrection, pretending it was from Peter. And here's what it says. Notice this compared to the story in the New Testament of the resurrection. Quote, early in the morning as the Sabbath dawned, there came a large crowd from Jerusalem to see the sealed tomb. But during the night, before the Lord's day dawned, as the soldiers were keeping guard 2 by 2, there came a great sound in the sky, and they saw the heavens opened, and 2 men descend, shining with a great light, and they drew near to the tomb. The stone which had been set on the door rolled away by itself, and moved to one side, and the tomb was opened, and both of the young men went in. Now that's kind of interesting, but you can see it's a little bit elaborated on more so than the gospel accounts. Now it gets weirder. I'm still back to the Gospel of Peter here. Now, when these soldiers saw that, they woke up the centurion and the elders. Because why? They were there keeping watch too. While they were yet telling them the things which they had seen, they saw 3 men come out of the tomb, 2 of them sustaining the other one, and a cross following after them. The heads of the 2 men they saw had heads that reached up to heaven, but the head of him that was led by them went beyond heaven. And they heard a voice out of the heaven saying, have you preached unto them that sleep? The answer that was heard from the cross was yes. Wow. So what do we have here? A big crowd. We got moving stones. We got heads of men stretching up to heaven and a walking and talking cross. Wow, that's exciting. They said, yeah, that's how you embellish the basic story. It says the New Testament resurrection accounts don't have anything like this. They're pretty bland. Right? So they give a lot of examples here. You can look in Mark 16, Luke 24, in John's Gospel, look at John 20. There's nothing like this. It's exaggeration. If the resurrection was a made-up story trying to convince skeptics, then they would have made the accounts longer with more detail. And we don't get that at all. So they're what they call theological restraint of the gospel writers. This says that seems to indicate that they're concerned about getting history correct. So I thought that was good. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says, there's nothing about going to heaven when you die, or life after death, or eternal life, nor even the resurrection of all Christ's people that's in those 4 resurrection stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I thought that was just kind of a level-headed discussion there of what happened. And then finally, number 10, the New Testament writers abandoned their long-held sacred beliefs and practices, adopted new ones, and did not deny their testimony under persecution or threat of death. I mean, just think about this. These were Jews, good Jews, Well, okay, Luke was a Gentile, but these are people who were hooked into the Jewish system big time. And what did they do? They gave up the animal sacrifice system. Well, that's something they had encountered their whole lives. They gave up the binding supremacy of the law of Moses. They gave up strict monotheism. Now they're worshiping Jesus. They gave up the Sabbath. Even though Exodus says you break the Sabbath, you get punished by death. They believed in a conquering Messiah. They gave that up, didn't they? I mean, Jesus is the opposite. He's a sacrificial lamb. Of course, that's the first visit. And he says it's not just the New Testament writers. Thousands of Jerusalem Jews, including Pharisee priests, convert to Christianity. They join the writers in abandoning those treasured beliefs. That's incredible. I mean, think about it. The Jewish people thought these institutions were given to them by God. And they thought if they abandoned them, they were risk damning their souls. And here comes Jesus. And it says 5 weeks after he's crucified, something like 10,000 Jews are following him. Something really big was going on. Now, if it's just a made-up story, why would this happen? So they've given up these old beliefs, but they've adopted some radical new beliefs. Like, when do they worship? Sunday, not Saturday. Now it's baptism that's a sign for the new covenant, just like circumcision was a sign of the old covenant. Now they've got communion. These are big, just huge changes. So I thought that was a really good point. Now, toward the end there, the chapter here, they mention something. Well, I don't know if I want to get into that. No, I think I'm going to end here. There's just a couple new points, but I don't want to take it off topic. So those are 10 reasons we can trust that they were telling the truth. Again, coming from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Wonderful book. Well written. A lot to chew on there. You can just dip in any place. You don't have to read them necessarily in order. Well, thank you for being part of this podcast, and hope your day is going well.